Hey there, 8th grade scholars. Welcome back. I am absolutely thrilled you're here today because honestly, we're going to unlock a secret that will completely transform how you experience literature. So today's explainer is titled Fluency, Punctuation, and Imagery Poetry Collection. Now, have you ever listened to someone read a poem out loud and it just sounded kind of like a robot reading a grocery list? Yeah, we've all been there. But today, we're learning how to read poetry like a total pro. We're going to ditch that robotic voice and really discover how to let the true power of a poem shine through your own voice.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. Section 1 is the line break myth. Section 2 is modeling the created stanza. Then in Section 3, we'll look at line breaks versus full stops. Section 4 is imagery versus vague adjectives. Section 5, interactive pause checks. And finally, Section 6, recap and transfer task. You guys are going to be acting like poetry detectives to crack the code of oral reading. Let's do it.
Section 1. The line break myth. Myth-busting poetry. We really got to start here because this is, without a doubt, the single most common mistake middle schoolers, and actually scratch that, even some adults, make when reading poetry out loud.
So I want you to think about your own reading habits for a quick second. Here's the question. Must you pause at the end of every poetic line? Like, when your eyes hit the right side of the page and the text just runs out, do you automatically stop, take a breath, and then jump to the next line? Well, here is the absolute truth. Line breaks do not automatically mean pause. Literally, if you stop mechanically at the end of every single line, regardless of what the sentence is actually doing, you are going to sound like a machine. You essentially chop the poet's thoughts into these tiny disconnected pieces, and the whole shebang, all that beautiful meaning, simply falls apart. No way do we want that.
Moving right along to Section 2, modeling the created stanza. Modeling in action. Let's apply this rule to a brand new stanza to see exactly what I mean.
Okay, listen closely. First, I'm going to read a newly created stanza the wrong way. The robotic way, pausing exactly at every visual line break. Listen carefully. The biting, icy wind, howling, through the dark forest, shakes the ancient pines until they snap, crashing loudly to the frozen ground below. Yikes, right? It sounds incredibly disjointed, kind of like jagged spikes on a graph. Now, what's really interesting about this is what happens when we shift things. Listen to how the meaning changes when we use punctuation to smooth it out into a much more fluid reading. The biting, icy wind howling through the dark forest shakes the ancient pines until they snap, crashing loudly to the frozen ground below. Wow, do you hear the difference there? That second reading wasn't dictated by the edge of the page. It was completely guided by the punctuation and the syntax.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 3, line breaks versus full stops, auditory clues. So if we aren't pausing at the end of the line, how on earth do we know when to take a breath? Well, we need to act as poetry detectives and look for the clues the poet left us on the page to know exactly when to pause.
And our very first clue is the end-stopped line. According to the Academy of American Poets glossary, an end-stopped line is a metrical line containing a complete phrase or sentence, or a line of poetry ending with punctuation. Basically, this is where the poet actually wants your voice to take a break. Think of a period, a comma, a semicolon. These are literally the traffic lights of poetry.
But what if there's no punctuation at the end of the line? Well, that is a fantastic poetic device called enjambment. This is defined as the continuation of a sentence or clause across one poetic line break. When you see enjambment, it's like a green light. Your voice should carry right through the visual break to finish the thought on the very next line.
So the crucial point here is that we must train our brains to separate the visual from the auditory. A line break is merely a visual pause on the page. It just tells your eyes to go back to the left margin. But a full stop, or really any punctuation, dictates the auditory pause. That's the real signal that tells your voice to rest.
Section 4, imagery versus vague adjectives. Guiding your pacing. Now that we have our punctuation map sorted out, let's explore how descriptive words also act as a vital map for our pacing and emphasis.
The Academy of American Poets defines imagery as language in a poem representing a sensory experience. This includes visual, auditory, olfactory, tactile, and gustatory senses. Basically, anything you can see, hear, smell, touch, or taste. And look, these aren't just pretty words. They are the emotional engine of the poem. They help create the entire mood.
Let's compare a vague adjective to sensory imagery. A phrase like the bad weather tells us very little, right? But the biting, icy wind howling, wow, you can almost feel it. And this brilliantly illustrates how a poet uses rich sensory imagery instead of flat, boring words. When you, as the reader, encounter these vivid words, you definitely shouldn't speed read past them. You must slow down, lean in a bit, and emphasize those sensory words to bring that whole physical experience to life in your oral delivery.
Jumping right into Section 5, Interactive Pause Checks, Test Your Skills. All right, 8th graders, it's time to put those detective hats firmly back on to test your new skills with some interactive pause checks based on the stanza we read earlier.
Here is pause check number 1. I want you to think back to our created stanza, the biting, icy wind howling through the dark forest. So, should you pause your voice after the word howling at the very end of line 1? I'll give you a second to decide.
Okay, if you said no pause, you are absolutely right. This is a classic example of enjambment. Because there's no punctuation after howling, and because the syntax of the phrase howling through the dark forest completely relies on staying connected to make sense, your voice must read straight through the line break to keep that meaning intact.
Awesome. Let's try pause check number 2. Look at line 3. Shakes the ancient pines until they snap, crashing loudly to the frozen ground below. Should you pause your voice after the word snap? Go ahead and make your choice.
And the answer is yes. That comma right after snap is your auditory clue. It's an end-stopped line, meaning the poet specifically placed a traffic light right there. Pausing here is incredibly effective because it builds just a split second of tension before we hit the really powerful auditory imagery of crashing loudly on the next line. It's punctuation and sensory imagery working perfectly together to dictate the delivery. Finally, we've arrived at Section 6, Recap and Transfer Task, your turn. Let's move to and see how this builds into your own independent reading as we summarize our findings and literally hand the microphone over to you.
Here is your strict 3-sentence recap to lock all this in. 1. Line breaks do not dictate auditory pauses, punctuation does. 2. Enjambment means reading through the visual break to complete the thought. 3. Vivid sensory imagery guides the emphasis and emotion in your vocal delivery.
And now for your transfer task. Here's an authorized stanza from the famous poem The Eagle by Lord Alfred Tennyson. Your mission is to read this stanza out loud to yourself right now. Look at the punctuation. Look at the enjambment. Look at the powerful imagery like crooked hands and azure world. As you read, ask yourself, how does my new understanding of punctuation and imagery change the power of my own voice? Remember, don't let the edge of the page dictate your flow, let the meaning guide you. Good luck, detectives. And as you practice, consider this. If changing your pauses can completely alter the feeling of a single stanza, how might reading like a pro change the way you understand the world's greatest stories?